evening. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to Talking Point. My name is Fahraaz Patel. We'd like to thank you, the viewer, for staying with us. And of course, we are on DSTV channel 347 on Hilaal TV. It has been a month since the current crisis of the war of Gaza had begun. 10,000 lives have been lost, many of them women and children. The United Nations, just under 2 weeks ago, voted for there to be a humanitarian ceasefire. Unfortunately, that has not unfolded, and more lives have been lost. In a crisis like this, there is many positives that have come. One of those positives have seen the governments of the world, well, some of them, especially within the global south, starting to sever their ties with Israel. In South Africa's case, we saw on Monday, where an announcement was made that the diplomats from Israel have been recalled. And just yesterday, we saw Minister of International Relations, Dr. Naledi Pandor, stating quite clearly that war crimes must be brought on against Israel and its Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. As South Africans, we would understand the word apartheid and what it, of course, hampered us, especially people of color within South Africa. And my next guest is somebody who knows apartheid very well. He suffered because of it. He understands the pain of those who suffered because of that oppressive system. And it's none other than Dr. Allan Boesak, who is my guest here on Talking Point today. Dr. Boesak, thank you so much for joining us, and a good evening to you. It is a real pleasure to have you on our show.
Good evening, Fahraaz, and good evening to all of your listeners. It is a privilege to join you on this show and in this conversation.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. Dr. Boesak, I want to start off, of course, with South Africa's decision that was made on Monday. It's quite a big one, isn't it? Because the question mark over where South Africa stands in this, the government's stand in this, was lingering. That decision was quite a strong one, wasn't it?
Well, let me put it in context a bit. I am deeply grateful that Minister Pandor raised the issue of South African calling this a crime against humanity and taking this issue, I presume, to the International Criminal Court. I think that is absolutely correct. But the recalling of our diplomats people should remember that already after that other tragedy that Israel inflicted upon Gaza and the Palestinians in 2014, then Minister of Foreign Affairs, Lindiwe Sisulu, did recall our ambassador from Israel, but not all of the diplomatic staff. So since then, it has operated on a diminished diplomatic presence in Israel. So recalling those diplomats that were left after Minister Sisulu had done what she had done is really a very small first step to what we have been insisting upon since October 7, more clearly than even before. Also keep in mind that the moment that President Cyril Ramaphosa became the president, he, because of what Lindiwe Sisulu had done, he demoted her from Foreign Affairs and put her in water and sanitation as a punishment for taking that step under the previous presidency. So you got to see this. So what is it that we have been asking for? We have been saying recalling the rest of our diplomats from Israel is only a very small step. The next step is this. We must shut down immediately, like Bolivia, for instance, had done, shut down the Israeli embassy so that we expel all of the embassy personnel here back to Israel. We must cut all ties, economic and otherwise, with the Israeli apartheid state by calling them also an apartheid state, which I see the minister has also done. So then it's logic. The logic is, if we call them an apartheid state, and we were an apartheid state, and one of the non-violent methods of pressure that we had put on the South African apartheid state government was boycotts and divestment and sanctions. And we see how effective those had been. I know, because I was in the middle of all of that campaign right through the 1980s into the early 1990s. And so we understood that that would be an effective measure that the international community would take. And so that is what we must do. We must do what countries like the US under President Biden cannot and will not do, or countries in Europe cannot or will not do. And we must do that not just because it is right. We must do that because we do have this special relationship with Palestine, always have been, and we must do that because we understand better than most people in the world what it means to live under an apartheid state that is terrorizing your people on a daily basis.
Dr. Boesak, South Africa, of course, not the only country to do the recalling of diplomats, or some countries have even taken that step more, Bolivia being one of them, to actually shut down the embassy. It's happening within the global South. The West, it's going to take, I don't know if it's going to take time, or they maybe just don't want to do it. But the perception is changing. The perception is changing, isn't it, Dr. Boesak?
Yeah. Well, we mustn't expect much from Western governments. Remember, the Western governments, from the US right through Europe, Western Europe, I'm talking about, they still represent an imperialist, colonialist presence in the world. The colonial presence of the West in Israel takes the form of an occupation, has been taking the form of an ongoing Nakba that has never stopped, merely moved from phase to phase to phase, and every phase has been more ferocious, and every phase has brought Israel closer to what I believe is their end goal, namely to erase the presence of Palestinians totally from the land of their birth, to make it impossible for Palestinians to live there, and to kill as many Palestinians as possible. Now, that's their goal. And the West has been consistent for 75 years in supporting that. We must not be surprised, Fahraaz, that that is their goal. I mean, before Western nations did their Holocaust on the Jews, before the Germans, let me put it that way, did their Holocaust on the Jews in the 1940s, they practiced upon Black people in the global South. And so we recall the Holocaust practiced against the Herero and the Ovambo people in Namibia in the late 19th century, beginning of the early 20th century. We recall in the 19th and 20th century, what is called the hidden Holocaust, practiced by Belgium and King Leopold II against the people of the Congo. And the numbers there are staggering. We are talking about 10 to 15 million Congolese. And so when they finally got to the Holocaust against the Jewish population in Germany, they had practiced upon us in Africa. And so they have a long history of being associated with, of practicing genocide. They did that to the Khoi and the San in the very beginning of the colonization of our country. So I'm saying we must not be too surprised that they are actively supporting Israel, giving financial aid, giving military aid. The weapons and the bombs that are falling upon Gaza right now are made in the US, given for gratis, for free, by the United States to Israel to continue the extermination of the Palestinian people. So that's one thing. The good thing, though, is that in the public of these Western countries, United States, Canada, and many of the Western countries, including Germany and France, we have seen a turning of the tide. I remember 10 years ago, you could not find 10 voices from the Jewish community publicly saying they stand for Palestine. There were, of course, always those anti-Zionists within the Jewish community. But They were mostly young people. They were students, and I saw some of them when I was teaching there, how they were punished, dragged before disciplinary committees from their universities because of their call for justice for Palestinians and freedom for all Palestinians. And so that has changed. When you look at what happened last week, and I suppose we can talk about that, 300,000 people on the streets of Washington, D.C. alone, 100,000 people on the streets of New York City, 150, 200,000 people in the streets of London. And so I can go on. That means that those governments in the West that are still supporting Israel in its genocidal war against the Palestinians are on their own. They do not have, emphatically so, they do not have the support of their own people anymore. And that support for Palestine has turned to these numbers and this intensity that I have and you have been witnessing for the last month is a miracle. It is a gift from God. And I hope it turns into a tide that will sweep these Western governments away and punish them at the polls so that we can have governments with the wisdom and the compassion and the sensitivity to understand what it means to do justice across the world and not to use your power for evil, but to use your power for good.
And of course, none more so when we saw a group of American Jews occupying the Statue of Liberty, and some of them, of course, occupying Capitol Hill. You've never seen that, as Dr. Boesak would say, probably 10 or 15 years ago. After the break, I continue my conversation with Dr. Allan Boesak. Do stay tuned to Talking Point. Welcome back to Talking Point. I'm in conversation with Dr. Allan Boesak. Dr. Boesak, over the weekend, a member of the Israeli cabinet said that we should, and I'm quoting, we should use an atom bomb to get rid of the people of Gaza. In a world that we are living in right now, where nuclear weapons or the use of nuclear weapons is such a scary thought, I mean, where's the accountability in saying such a word and he just gets a suspension, that's about it? And still, the government that he represents, where he made those comments, there seems to be a resounding scot-free approach to all of this.
Well, that's an important issue for us. Keep in mind that that Minister Eliyahu was called to account in a very light way, as you mentioned. And why? It is not because he said that there should be a nuclear bomb dropped on Gaza, but because he said it out loud. He should not have said it out loud. That caused embarrassment for Netanyahu and his government in the eyes of his sponsors and his supporters in the West. That's not a thing you say out loud. You may be doing it, but you don't say it out loud. That is the one thing. But the second thing we must remember is Minister Eliyahu had said this because it is common cause among him and his colleagues that you should wipe out the Palestinian people as a whole by any means necessary. Remember, the first person who mentioned this in public was the Israeli president, Herzberg, I think is his name.
Yeah, it's okay.
Herzog, yeah. Well, he said that he considers every Palestinian, woman, man, child, baby, it doesn't matter. All of them are the enemies of Israel. All of them are Hamas, and all of them should be exterminated. Now, when you say something like that, and you are the president of the country, you set the tone. And since then, we have had other members of parliament, including Netanyahu himself, saying the same thing, but in different words. But the end goal is always the annihilation by any means necessary of the Palestinian people. The third thing you must remember is, I don't know whether an atom bomb would make much difference in terms of what Israel is actually already doing. Remember that Israel had dropped bombs on Gaza that had many times the strength of the bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki and on Japan's cities in the Second World War. Remember that when the bomb that they dropped on Jabalia camp, that's most dense camp in the most dense city population-wise, in the most dense area population-wise, in the whole wide world. It was a 2,000-pound bomb that they dropped, and they bombed it, 3 times already in 1 week. So what is that? I mean, so the power that is being unleashed from the sky upon the people of Gaza has already had the effect of an atomic bomb. The only difference is it is not a real nuclear bomb, and Netanyahu will not do that. Not that he didn't want to, but because he knows the fallout will not just be on Palestinian people. Those gases, those fumes, everything that is unleashed by a nuclear bomb will inevitably drift over Israel and maybe wider than that area. And so that they cannot afford. They're not doing it because they don't want to do it. They're not doing it because they think those consequences will be even worse for themselves than the consequences for the Palestinians. And so it's a kind of a very self-centered, selfish motivation that is keeping them from doing that, because as that minister was arguing, it would get the job done quicker. So instead of having nightly and daily and hourly flights bombarding the same people on the ground in every single which way, and it takes you maybe 2 weeks or 3 weeks, now a month, it will be longer. Just get it over within a few minutes, and then it's done. And then we will deal with the fallout. That's what goes on in his mind. But it shows you, if this is the thinking of the leadership, what do you expect from a country like that?
It borders lines on scary, even goes beyond just the word scary itself. Dr. Boesak, during the days of apartheid here, we knew the National Party had nuclear power. And then we had individuals like Wouter Besson who used chemical warfare against so many people of color. So one would understand, and you would know better, just how powerful the word nuclear is and just how scary its effects would have been. Because I remember my grandparents telling me, I remember my parents telling me, if the National Party could, they would drop a bomb on Langa, they would drop a bomb on Khayelitsha, they would drop a bomb on Soweto. The thinking was there, wasn't it? But they themselves knew the effects it would have if they were to drop a bomb as powerful as that on the townships where many of the people of color lived.
Oh, no question, no question. If they could, they would. Their difficulty, I think, was really what would the consequences be in the international community. So remember, since 1960, not before, but since 1960 and the Sharpeville massacre, and especially 1976, and the revolution of the children in South Africa, world opinion began to swing our way. People across the international community began to understand what we were dealing with. In other words, with a terrorist state that was inflicting terror upon the population for racist, supremacist, white supremacist, colonialist reasons. Now, the reasons of Israel is the same, but Israel could get away with it for all of this time until now because the international community did not give a single moment of thought to what was happening to Palestine and to Palestinian people, and especially to Palestinian children. Now, however, in the last month, as we said before, we have seen this most remarkable turning of the tide. Grand Central Station is a huge place. I was there. Thousands of Jews packed into that place. 400 of them being arrested for refusing to stop chanting, for refusing to stop demonstrating, for refusing to stop calling Biden a genocider. Now, so for the first time, what we had and what the Palestinians never had until now was a growing feeling of international indignation and international solidarity. More and more people standing up, especially Jews now, and saying, what you are doing in Israel, you cannot do in my name. And so that is, to me, a very important thing. The question is, will the impact of this turning of the tide be quick enough to stop what Israel is doing right now? Will we get the ceasefire that they are asking for and that is so absolutely necessary? I'm not talking about a humanitarian pause. That's a different matter. That's a totally cynical way of looking at it. I'm talking about a complete ceasefire. That the United States says to Israel, if you drop one more bomb on Gaza, we will this minute cut off every single penny of aid. We will not ever support you again. We will stop our support in the United Nations, so that when for next week there is a new resolution, the US will back that resolution, and then Israel is gone. So the question is only, will what we see in the hearts and the minds and in the process of the people bring the governments to a point where they will turn on their own decisions and make the right decision for the first time in almost a century? That is the question right now. And will South Africa government come out also, apart from expelling the Israeli diplomats, with an immediate call for a ceasefire, so that we can begin the moment of thinking differently about how this war is being waged and where it's going?
After the break, I continue my conversation with Dr. Allan Boesak. We're going to be talking the role of civil society and activists in raising the continuous awareness about the plight of the Palestinians. Do stay tuned to Talking Point. Welcome back to Talking Point. I'm still in conversation with Dr. Allan Boesak, anti-apartheid activist. Dr. Boesak, last week, of course, and us as a channel, Hilaal TV, were there. You were, of course, standing alongside Sheikh Ibrahim Gabriels from the MJC and Sheikh Abdul Khalik Ali, also from UXA. And it was so beautiful to see, because it saw people from different faiths getting together for the cause of humanity. And this is what it is. It's not about being Muslim. It's not about being someone from a faith. It's just about being human. You were there, Dr. Boesak, and it was a continuous protest that has been happening, especially in the city of Cape Town. It's protests like this, isn't it, that continues to raise the awareness of what is happening in Gaza and what is happening in Palestine.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely right. On the first point, it never was a question of religion. It never was a question of Muslims standing up for Muslims because it's Muslims. It's a question of we all getting together, as you say, called by the one God who is all in all justice and love and mercy and grace and judgment, but to whom we are answerable. And to whom we bow. And so once you heard that voice calling you to honor your God by honoring God's children, anywhere where they might be, and anywhere where there might be injustice, and anywhere where there might be oppression, our call is to find ways to stand up for them. If their voices are being silent, our voices must be raised. Where it's necessary, you step into the breach for them. And the wounds that would be inflicted upon them should be inflicted upon you. I mean, that is what our understanding is. And when you mention all these names, I think back to people like Sheikh Nazim, and I think back to Imam Hassan Solomons, with whom I was first arrested on our very first march after the 1976 sort of first wave in 1977, 78, and 79. And we went to prison together. And there we talked together in that prison cell, Muslims and Christians and one Jewish young woman. You talk, and we asked the question, what is it, despite the odds and despite the dangers and despite what we know these police and army can do to us, what is it in your faith that made you take the risk to come out here? And I must say, that afternoon in that prison cell, while we were waiting to be bailed out, was one of the most meaningful moments in my life. When Hassan died and I went to visit him while he was very, very ill, he said to me, Allan, I always knew that one day Allah will not ask me whether I did the right ritual, this hand or that hand. Allah will ask me, what did you do for justice? And that is something I will carry with me. And so for us now, it is a question, what will we do for justice, for humanity's sake? And how long will we wait for children to die before we actually do what we can do as a country, and make sure that the people of Palestine understand that we understand what embodied solidarity actually means. And so yes, for a person of faith, there can be no other choice. In Christian terminology, we talk about a kairos moment. That means it's a moment that God has given you to discern that this is something in history that if I not take the moment right now to do what is right and just and work for peace and for humanity, if I miss this moment, I miss my understanding of who my God is and what my calling is vis-a-vis my God and vis-a-vis my neighbor. And so that is a kairos moment. I believe that this crisis in Gaza, the actions of the Israeli government, this is a kairos moment for us, for our government, and for South Africa's people. And I thank God for those who are coming together. There is going to be another march this coming Saturday. I'm going to be speaking in Gainesville Mosque this coming Friday. We must use every opportunity God gives us. And we must create those opportunities to call our government to account, to push them to do what we must do, and to make sure that Palestine understands that in South Africa, also, not just in London or Paris or New York or Washington, D.C., there are people who know what it means to stand up for those whom we must stand up for in this critical hour.
And I want to talk about that, Dr. Boesak, because I never knew about a South African Jews for a Free Palestine or Jews for Peace, based, of course, in the United States. And they're, of course, individuals who have all the privilege. They can walk into Israel, they can get citizenship, and that's it. They can live peacefully there or live a very comfortable life, I must say, within Israel. But they've taken the decision that when you see oppression happening, it just cannot occur under their watch. All these organizations coming together, and even Christian organizations coming together, somebody like Reverend Frachikani, for example, you know, they've taken the step. You see that, the three faiths, the children of Abraham. That's beautiful, isn't it? Because
that's beautiful. It is absolutely beautiful. You know, and one Jewish friend of mine in the United States says to me, of course, there's always, especially now, when you think of the children of Gaza, just the kids, I mean, that already should shake you to your foundation. But he says to me, you know, when I started thinking about this, they say to us, come over and you can get Israeli citizenship and we'll provide you a home. Then I go over there and then I see, but the home that they are giving me is a home that has been stolen from Palestinian people who are now refugees in their own country. The land on which they build my new settlement home is stolen land. What gives me the right to do that? My neighbor who's a settler, all of us are forced into the Israeli army. All of us are armed. We have weapons that they give to us to defend ourselves after we had come and occupied and stolen other people's land. So if those people dare to ask us a question or dare to say, why have you done this to me? What have I done to you? Then we have the right to shoot them. And it's okay because we can always say it's a terrorist. And he says to me, when I think of those things, and when I think of how do I explain to my children that this is how we come to be where we are today, he says, I cannot do that. I cannot do that. So he packed his bags and went back to the United States. And this is the kind of new thinking. And also, of course, for them it is important to understand, for us, as it is important for us to understand, is that Jewishness, Judaism, has got nothing to do with Zionism. Judaism is the religion of the children of Abraham. Zionism is a 19th century racist, supremacist, exclusivist political ideology built not on religious understanding, but on secular political ideas of new colonialism that have nothing to do with the faith of the children of Abraham that we see in the Jewish community. And so for us, it's very important to know that when you see a Jew, you're not necessarily seeing a Zionist. There are Jews who want to be Jews with all their heart, but they cannot be a Zionist. And those are the people that we see standing with us and standing with Palestine in solidarity. Some because of their faith, some outside of the faith. It does not matter. God brings together what God needs to bring together for the sake of this one thing that needs to be done. And at this moment, it is saving the lives of Palestine children. It is saving the lives of Palestinian men and women. It is bringing the land back and them returning to the land. It is about justice and peace and freedom. That is what this moment is all about.
Dr. Boesak, before we go to the break, when the Nakba occurred, obviously in the late 1940s, it had such a stark reminiscent of South Africa.
Yes.
I mean, you being from Cape Town, District 6, here in Johannesburg with the Indian community, Fitas, where they had to then go to places like Lenasia and Azadville and various areas, which of course the Indian community created. The black community were chased away. They were chased into townships. And they were given even the more harsher punishment of carrying the dompas, where they had to work in mines, come back home. That was it. If you were a domestic worker, you go with your dompas, you go to your white employer, you do your job, you go back home. And we see 2 weeks ago where the Israeli government saying, you need to relocate. Where do they relocate to? And we're asking ourselves this question. It's happening again. It's happening again. History is repeating itself. That is the sadness of all of what is happening, isn't it?
You're absolutely right. But I've always made the point for us that our apartheid was in many, many ways not nearly as ferocious as the apartheid that Israel is inflicting upon the Palestinians. We had the Dompas, we had the Group Areas Act, we had land stolen, not just from 1913 and 1936, those land acts, but from 1652, the moment the Dutch set foot in there. And the first battle for the land took place in 1657, right here in Cape Town, on the banks of the Kamisa River, where Van Riebeeck first tried to build a fortification so that they can settle permanently. That's where the first fight under a Khoi leader by the name of Auchimau took place. So our battles go way back 300 years and more. But we recognize immediately, and if we recognize that the apartheid, I mean, we've never, you're right, we were killed by the hundreds, but we have never seen such a thing as a constant bombing on Soweto or on our townships or something like that white South Africans have done. And so in that measure, even the apartheid of South Africa in all of its evilness and its crime against humanity, even that is being surpassed by what Israel is doing to Palestinians. And as a black South African who has been born under apartheid, who grew up under apartheid, who fought apartheid, who see some of apartheid fall, I say to South Africans, think of our situation, but think of it 1,000 times worse. And then you stand up, and then you fight for what you would have fought for yourself, for your life, your future, of your children. That is what we must see when we stand up for Palestine. We're seeing brothers and sisters in a situation that is even worse than ours was. And so they need for our not understanding and not our pious words, but our active solidarity is greater than we must ever not begin to imagine is not necessary. And so that, for me, whenever I think of the comparisons, that's how I think of what that comparison should look like.
After the break, I wrap up my conversation with Dr. Allan Boesak. We talk, how far is the liberation of Palestine? We saw it in South Africa when democracy dawned. Are we close? Are we still very far from that happening? Do stay tuned to Talking Point. Welcome back to Talking Point. I'm wrapping up my conversation with Dr. Allan Boesak. Dr. Boesak, I want to bring in the United Nations as obviously a global security body. And we see Secretary General Antonio Guterres, of course, make calls of what is currently happening in Gaza. When, of course, apartheid was here in South Africa, the United Nations took time, but they, of course, had labeled South Africa as an apartheid state. And, of course, the sanctions had been applied. How far are we from Israel having the same faith the government of the National Party had in terms of sanctions? Because it really does seem quite a long time for that to happen, isn't it?
Well, I mean, we've been calling for sanctions on the Israeli government for a very long time now. The difficulty with the United Nations, one can say that in a sense, the United Nations has completely failed the people of Palestine. That is true. The difficulty, though, is that the United Nations is captured by those 5 nations who have the veto right on any resolution that the General Assembly takes. And so from the very moment, look, Israel is a creation jointly by the United States and the United Kingdom. And so the present state of Palestinians is a creation of the US and the United Kingdom, and later the other countries in Europe, especially Germany. But every time the vast majority of the General Assembly calls for sanctions or something to keep Israel to account or to do something about that situation, the US vetoes that. And so that is the bind in which they are. And so we see that up to this point, what is it now? 88 United Nations workers targeted and killed by the Israeli government. We see United Nations hospitals, United Nations institutions, refugee centers, schools, all of that willfully being targeted and deliberately being destroyed. Why? Because Israel knows that when push comes to shove, Joe Biden will say in the UN, I will veto any action against Israel in this body. And so that makes it hard for the United Nations. But the United Nations should do what it can do and what it must do. And so we must join the General Secretary when he finally calls it what it is. It is a genocide. It's no longer a war. It is not self-defense. You do not employ self-defense against babies in incubators. You do not wage a war that includes cutting off water in electricity and communications so that even the glass of water that you could give your dying child in the streets, that is no longer possible. So we must call the evil for what it is. And if that is all we can do, you must build the moral case, not just the legal case. The legal case, I think, has been built. It is a genocide. There are war crimes being done. It is a crime against humanity. The lawyers can work on that. And that is the case that must go to the International Criminal Court when this is over. That's one thing. But I'm talking about building the moral case. Now, as a person, I can't do much. President Cyril Ramaphosa can. He can close down the embassy immediately. I can't. But I can help our people, and we together can help together ourselves to build the moral case, to stir people's consciousness, to say you cannot wake up in the morning without thinking what is happening in Palestine. You can't go to bed at night without having done something during the day for the sake of the children of Palestine. I preach often, and there's a story that I tell that I read in a book once written by Allan Boesak about this principle, school principal in Soweto during the times of the Soweto Revolution, who always was the most understanding man, the most patient man. White people loved him because he tried to calm the kids down and so forth. And one day they saw him with the children marching, and then they saw him making a speech on the stage at a rally. And so his white friends asked him, "What are you doing? You are our only patient person out there. You must tell the kids to keep calm." And then he said to them, "You know what? I was thinking about it. I will die one day. And then I will appear before the great judge of heaven. And then the great judge will ask me, 'Where are your wounds?' And if I say to the judge, 'I have none,' they will ask me, 'Was there then nothing to fight for?'" That is what we must build. That moral case, that moral responsibility, that issue that I cannot open my eyes and close my eyes without having done something, going to my God with a body that is free from wounds, that should be unthinkable. Going to my God with a conscience that have never wrestled in the middle of the night, that is unthinkable. And so when God asks me, "Where are your wounds?" I want to be able to say, "Here are my wounds, God." Why? Because I stood up for the poor and for the weak and for the oppressed, and I stood up for the children. That's my rationalization in life.
Dr. Boesak, one final question to wrap up what has been a really wholesome conversation. You're a Christian, I'm a Muslim, the city of Jerusalem, and this is the question of liberation. And we saw that happen, of course, in South Africa at the dawn of democracy in 94. I was only 6 years old, but I could understand what it was at the time. When you listen to your grandparents, when you listen to your parents, the beauty of liberation, the beauty of freedom. And both of us would like to walk into Jerusalem because it's a sacred place for Muslims. It's a sacred place for Christians like yourself. It's a sacred place for Jewish people also, and all three faiths can come together and be in that beautiful city of Jerusalem. And that's what we want, isn't it? That liberation where we can practice in front of our God and do so without anyone telling us, "Where's your dompas? You need to be out here by a certain time." The freedom to do what we want to do, it's coming, isn't it? The question is just how long.
That's right. That's right. I mean, and Jerusalem is that symbol. And in the Bible, in the Christian scriptures, in that very last book called the Book of Revelation, there is a vision that outside of the city there is a river, and by the side of the river there is the tree of life, and the tree of life shall be for the healing of the nations. And that is what you described right now. That is the image that comes up in my mind. But right now, that city has a wall. That wall is a separation wall. It is an apartheid wall. It is a wall that symbolizes tyranny and terror and death. But I was only once allowed into Israel and to Palestine. And I was in Bethlehem, and on that side of the wall, I saw something written by a young artist. And it says, "This wall may have a present, but it has no future." And that's what I say to my Palestinian friends and to my South African brothers and sisters all the time. That is what we must remember, that hope and capture, that determination captured in those words. This wall stands today. It may have a present, it is here now, but it has no future. Why? Because our courage, our determination, our love for God, our love for one another, our love for justice and freedom will break down that wall. Our bodies will break down that wall, and it will no longer exist. And there we will have access to that city, and we will have access to that river, alongside which the tree is planted that shall be for the healing of the nations. And that should be what we have in mind all the time as we continue to march, as we continue to protest, as we continue to set our demands, as we continue to say to Palestinians, this is what our love looks like. It is justice in action.
Dr. Boesak, we'd like to thank you so much for joining us here on Talking Point. As I said, it has been a wholesome conversation. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It is a privilege to be with you. Good night.
Good night. It's Dr. Allan Boesak, anti-apartheid activist. And as we, of course, close off the show, we remember the children who continue to lose their lives in Gaza. And, of course, the 10,000 people that have lost their lives. I've got something very close to me, of course, the journalists that continue to lose their lives by doing just their job. That is reporting on the ground what is currently happening within that part of Palestine. From myself, Fahraaz Patel, and the rest of the team here on Talking Point, I would like to thank you, the viewer, for staying with us. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.